At 10 p.m. on January 31st, 2012, a 23-year-old man named Chen Rongyu walked into an internet cafe in New Taipei City, Taiwan. The cafe had a front counter where a cashier would check you in and sell you snacks and drinks. And then from where he was looking, behind the cashier were all these tables, these long rows of tables with different computer stations at them. And there was at least about 30 people already sitting behind each of these terminals, fully engrossed in whatever game or whatever they were doing on the internet. And not one of these people even looked up when Chen walked inside. I mean, nobody was interested in Chen. But for Chen, that was sort of part of the allure of this cafe. He got to, sit down and play his game and be totally left alone. And so Chen walked up to the counter and paid for some time. He also bought a soda, and then he walked around back. He found an empty computer, sat down, and immediately fired up his favorite game, League of Legends. League of Legends is a multiplayer online battle arena game that's extremely popular all over the world. And Chen took this game very seriously. He routinely would spend 8-hour-long marathon sessions at this internet cafe just playing League of Legends to try to level up and move up in the ranking system. And so today, that's what Chen was going to do. And so after the game was booted up, he immediately locked in and he was in his first battle. And then before long, hours had gone by and he hadn't even gotten up. And then eventually, a couple times he got up to get a soda refill and to get a snack. But he basically just all night gamed, just nonstop, periodically stopping to literally put his head down on the table and take a 15-minute power nap, only to get right back up and get back into the game. And so all night, he's just on this game. By a little after noon on February 1st, Chen had been gaming nearly nonstop for 14 hours, which was long even by his standards. But he couldn't stop now. He was exhausted, but he was doing great. This is like one of the best sessions he had ever had. And right at that moment, he was in the middle of this really intense match where his team was about to get knocked out by this really good opponent. And if Chen could just lock in, they could pull out a win. And so Chen was super focused, leaned forward, hands flying across his keyboard and mouse, and he managed to dodge an attack. And then he geared up for the big strike. And right as he did, something went wrong. About 9 hours later, around 9 p.m., the cashier at this internet cafe had just finished giving another soda to one of the customers, and then they looked out and she noticed there was nobody else in line. Now, the job of this cashier was not just to check people in and give them snacks and drinks. It was also to keep the cafe clean and also, critically, to periodically make rounds and kick people out once their time had expired. Because oftentimes, a lot of these gamers would get sucked into their games, lose track of time, and basically end up playing for longer than they'd actually paid for. So the cashier grabbed her clipboard with all the information about each of the customers and how long they had paid for, and then she began making her rounds in the back. And part of it was she needed to speak basically to all the people that were there and kind of confirm that they were supposed to be here still. But as she walked into the back, per usual, nobody looked up at her. All these people at all their terminals were heads down, fully focused on their game, completely immersed. And so she began going, one person to the next, being like, hey, are you good? Did you pay for your time? Are you going to be here any bit longer? And a lot of these guys, they'd finally look up and be totally shocked she's even standing next to them because they weren't paying attention at all. But, one by one, she checked each of the monitors and eventually she got to Chen. And when she got to Chen, Chen was focused on this game entirely to the point where when she said, hey, your time is up. You've been here for 24 hours. You paid for, 8 or 9 or whatever it was. Chen didn't even look up at her. Nothing she could do could get Chen to even acknowledge her. He was so focused on the game. And so eventually the cashier, out of frustration, was like, hey, and she kind of tapped his shoulder, and Chen leaned back. And when he did, and the cashier got a good look at him, she screamed. It would turn out, until this very moment, Chen had gotten his wish. He had come to this cafe 24 hours earlier and been totally left alone. He got to exclusively just play his game in his own world. In fact, the whole time he was here, no one had even looked at him. Because if they had, they would have seen something was horribly wrong. It was the cashier who walked over to him and tapped on his shoulder who noticed what was wrong. Here's what the cashier saw. This is a picture of Chen, and Chen is in full rigor mortis. Because 9 hours earlier, when he was in the middle of that really intense fight with that opponent who was about to beat Chen and his team, Chen, he got really excited and he was about to land that big strike that potentially could have been the blow that would have won the match. Well, he was so amped up that Chen had a heart attack and died. And for the 9 hours after he died, when he was still in the same position he was in playing the game, nobody noticed. He just sat there appearing to be fully alive, locked into the game like everybody else. but he was actually dead. And so it wasn't until the cashier tapped Chen on the shoulder and he rocked backwards, still in his gaming position, but because he's in rigor mortis, his hands kind of jutted out in front of him up into the air, that she realized he was actually dead. Chen's family would later say that he had pre-existing heart issues that very likely contributed to his fatal heart attack. On the afternoon of October 11th, 2023, a 48-year-old man named Samuel Gomez stood in the lobby of the Moxie Hotel in Portland, Oregon, talking to the concierge. Samuel had flown in from Phoenix earlier that morning because he was speaking at a conference in Portland later that week. But for now, he was just going to go out and enjoy the sights, and so he had asked the concierge to give him some local recommendations. The concierge named a few cool local places, Samuel thanked him, and then he headed out the front door onto the road. And as soon as Samuel was outside, he immediately heard this loud commotion happening right down the street. And he turned and looked in the direction, and he saw this kind of gaggle of people and cars sort of standing in what looked like a big circle around whatever was happening over there. Samuel couldn't tell what it was, but people were honking and people had their phones out filming sort of whatever was in the middle of the circle. And from the looks of it, it appeared there was at least one police officer in his car sort of beginning to marshal the scene and block traffic. But, there was just this chaotic scene happening, and Samuel really had no idea what it was. But naturally, being a human, he was interested. He wanted to see what was going on. And so Samuel began walking down the road, and as he did, he pulled out his phone, opened up his camera, and began filming and taking pictures. And as he got closer to whatever was going on here, the cacophony of horns and people yelling and all the chaos just got louder and louder, and it still wasn't clear at all to Samuel what the heck this even was. And so he just continued to take photos and just kind of be an onlooker. And at some point, when Samuel got right up close and actually was standing right near that police officer blocking traffic, he happened to turn his phone and aim his camera at the police officer. And when he did, he took a photo. Here is the photo he took. As you can see, the police officer is aiming his gun directly at Samuel. And that's because this is not a police officer. Samuel just thought he was a police officer. When he looked down the road at this crazy scene, he saw this guy in a car who sort of appeared to be, maybe an undercover cop, sort of, in the right place at the right time, taking charge and handling whatever this was. When in reality, this man who's in this photo is a guy named Jeffrey Hammond who had just been involved in a road rage incident, and he shot and killed a 47-year-old man named Ryan Martin. That was the scene that Samuel had walked out to. Jeffrey Hammond shooting and killing Ryan Martin. That's what everybody was reacting to. And so as Samuel walked down the road, not knowing that, he inadvertently stood right in front of the shooter who was still sort of crazed, aimed his camera at him, right as Jeffrey Hammond swung his gun around and shot Samuel. So literally seconds after this photo was taken, Samuel got shot. Luckily though, Samuel would survive the shooting. As for Jeffrey Hammond, he was arrested and charged with murder, and as far as we know, he is currently in jail awaiting trial. On April 5th, 2018, a young man named Luis Hernandez sat inside of a small stone shack with a metal roof on a rural property in northern Venezuela. Luis was a painter, and for the last year or so, this shack had doubled as both his home and his art studio. And it was basically always a mess. There was dirty dishes and food everywhere, and all his paint supplies were scattered all over the ground. But the walls were all adorned with all of his beautiful and most prized possessions, his artwork. He mainly painted really dramatic-looking portraits in very bold colors. In fact, when he was actually doing his painting, when he was in the middle of the floor, right in the center of his shack, on one wall, there was this face of a man he had done, all in red, and then on the left, on the other wall, was this woman's face, all in blue, but with bright red lips. And these paintings were both so intense that at times, as he was doing his work, it sort of felt like they were both looking at him. But on this particular day, as Luis sat in the middle of his shack, working on his latest project, he put that weird thought out of his mind that, his paintings were watching him and just focused instead on getting this done. He had one more beautiful portrait he was working on, and he took his paintbrush and he dipped it in the black ink, and he put the finishing touches on it. And when this portrait was done, Luis kind of sat back and took it all in, and he couldn't help but feel a bit emotional. Because this project, it was different than any other he had ever done. He wasn't doing it for fun. He wasn't doing it for pay. He was doing it as a way to cope with a big crisis in his life. So this shack where Luis worked and lived, and also the rural property that it sat on, belonged to Luis's boyfriend, Lisandro Rosales Garcia. Lisandro and Luis had met about a year earlier when Luis was really down on his luck and was actually homeless, living out on the streets. But Lisandro had seen Luis and offered to let him come live in this shack on his property, which was out in the middle of nowhere. And Luis, who's got no other options, is like, awesome, yes, I'd love to do that. And so he moves out into the shack, and pretty quickly after moving in, Luis and Lisandro, they formed a more romantic relationship, and Luis was so happy. He felt like Lisandro was the one person who really understood him and truly supported his art. But then, about 2 months ago, Lisandro had just gone missing. The police were looking into it, but so far, Luis had not gotten any updates. And so Luis was handling this huge gap in his life now, the only way he knew how to, which was with his art. And so this latest project he had just finished was sort of like a tribute to his missing boyfriend. But as Luis put his brush down and stood up to admire his work, he suddenly heard voices from outside. Now, this was highly unusual because this property really was very remote. I mean, the only time Luis or Lisandro would see people here was if they invited them, and Luis had not invited anyone. But before Luis could even react to, these strangers on his property, those people outside began pounding on Luis's front door. And so Luis, he opened up the door, and standing there were all these police officers. And Luis's first reaction was, oh, they must be here to give me some updates about Lisandro's disappearance. But these police officers, they didn't give an update. Instead, they just pushed past Luis into the art studio and began scooping up all his paints and paintbrushes. And then at some point, one of the officers actually looked down and saw the final project that Luis had been working on, his tribute to his missing boyfriend. And when the officer saw that painting, he turned around, ran outside, and vomited. Here is a picture of that tribute. Now, at first glance, this piece of art is totally unremarkable. It appears to be some sort of stained glass with green leaves and some blue and red flowers. But when you consider the types of supplies that Luis used to make this particular piece of art, you'll realize how horrifying this image actually is, and it's what caused that officer to vomit. It would turn out Luis was not just a painter. He was also a serial killer. And what he would do is after he killed his victims, he would use their blood, their ashes, and their other body parts to paint all of his paintings. Now, at first, Luis and Lisandro were actually a happy couple. However, at some point in February of 2018, they got into some kind of fight, and Luis killed Lisandro and quickly began using his body parts to create this tribute to his boyfriend. If you look again at the tribute painting, all the red that is used is Lisandro's blood, and all the black that's used is Lisandro's ashes. All told, police would find the remains of at least 6 people on that property. They also found evidence that Luis was not just using their body parts to make art, he was also cannibalizing his victims. Luis was arrested and made a full confession. As far as we know, he is currently incarcerated in Venezuela. 3:30 p.m. on November 21st, 2016, Jody Santoro, who was a 21-year-old mother in Melbourne, Australia, woke up to the sound of her 4-month-old son crying. Outside, there was this horrible thunderstorm going on. All this rain and hail were pelting the roof, and the wind was so strong that all the windows in the house were rattling. Jody reached over and grabbed her phone on the nightstand and checked the time, and she saw right away that she had overslept. However, it had been a really hot day that day, and she was so drained from the heat and also taking care of a 4-month-old that she wasn't really surprised she had overslept. But as the sound of her son's cries intensified, Jody knew, no matter how tired she was, she needed to get up and go tend to him. But the instant her legs swung off the bed and she actually tried to stand up, she knew something was wrong, and it had nothing to do with being tired. She had this incredible sense of dizziness come over her, and then her chest suddenly tightened up to the point where she could barely even breathe in. She found herself grabbing the bed just to steady herself. However, as alarming as this was, Jody didn't panic. She knew this feeling. She had been dealing with asthma for years, and she knew this was the start of an asthma attack. And so Jody reached over for her inhaler on the nightstand. She picked it up, brought it to her lips, pressed it down, and then took in a measured breath of the medication, expecting to pretty much immediately feel relief. But she didn't. The inhaler wasn't working. Jody again pressed down the inhaler harder this time and took a bigger breath in, hoping that a bit more medication might do the trick. But again, it just was not working. And so now with panic rising inside of her, she's, still struggling to breathe. Her son is still freaking out and she can't tend to him. And all she was thinking is, I have to get my nebulizer, which is basically a more robust version of an inhaler. It provides more medication more quickly into your body. However, the nebulizer, which was just over in her closet, required some setup. And she knew she felt so frantic right now and she was shaking so much that she didn't think she'd be able to set it up or even set it up in time before she passed out. Just then, her fiance walked into the bedroom, drawn there by the sound of their son crying. But the second he walked in, his attention was not on their son. It was instead on Jody, who by now was clutching the bed and kind of hobbled over and very clearly having some sort of medical emergency. Jody turned to him and began to say, I can't breathe. But her fiance already knew knew she had asthma. He knew what these attacks looked like. And so without even needing to be told, he rushed to the closet, set up her nebulizer, and then put the mask right over her face. And as soon as it was, Jody took in the biggest inhale she possibly could, really believing this was going to stop the asthma attack. But just like the inhaler, the nebulizer didn't work. It felt like with every breath she was taking, her lungs were shrinking, not expanding. And so Jody turned to her fiance and croaked out, "Call an ambulance," her voice barely audible. And so her fiance, who also was now beginning to panic, grabbed the phone, and as he was talking to the dispatcher, trying to relay all the details of what was happening, outside this thunderstorm was only getting worse and worse. The hail and the rain were battering the sides of the house, and all the windows were shaking. I mean, it was absolute bedlam inside of this house. The next few minutes were torture for Jody. She laid on the bed waiting for paramedics. Her breaths at this point were so small, so shallow, like she knew she was about to pass out any second. And then finally, the paramedics rushed inside. She knew there were 2 people in the room, but it was so chaotic. And all she could say when they showed up in the room was, "I'm going to die. I'm going to die." The paramedics lifted her off the bed. They put her on the gurney. And as they wheeled her out the door towards the ambulance, her world went totally black. The paramedics rushed Jody to Sunshine Hospital, and on the way, they tried to stabilize her by squeezing these oxygen bags, forcing oxygen into Jody's lungs. And as they were doing that, Jody's fiance was following the ambulance right behind, white-knuckling the steering wheel, praying his fiance was going to survive this asthma attack. When the ambulance finally arrived at Sunshine Hospital, the emergency room was mayhem. Paramedics quickly wheeled Jody in on her gurney, shouting out her vital signs to the doctors waiting near the door. Her fiance, meanwhile, watched helplessly as the medical staff surrounded her and inserted IV lines, hooked up monitors, and began intubating her to force even more oxygen into her lungs. But fortunately, this rapid medical intervention, once Jody got to the hospital, appeared to work, because not long after getting there, Jody did begin to stabilize, not enough to suggest that she was actually all better, but her condition basically began to improve. However, the moment she began to improve, instead of the medical team, talking to her and figuring out what happened and making sure she really was on a path to recovery here, instead, the medical team literally ran out of her room, back out to the front of the ER, because by this point, the Sunshine Hospital ER was overflowing with patients. There were all these people in the waiting room and also outside, and basically everybody had the same symptoms as Jody. They couldn't breathe. There were people slumped on the ground against the wall, screaming for help. I mean, the medical team was totally overwhelmed. And on top of that, there were ambulances literally lined up around the block, waiting to drop off patients. There just wasn't any more space. But nonetheless, doctors and nurses and the medical team at the hospital worked furiously, moving from one patient to the next, sometimes in an exam room, sometimes out in the waiting room, sometimes outside. It's wherever the patients were. But the weird thing is all these people, they had the same symptoms, these severe asthma attacks. Yet many of the people that were showing up had never had asthma in their lives before. So how was this happening? This went on for hours and hours. And really, the situation in the hospital only continued to get worse, with more and more and more patients showing up with worse and worse symptoms. And so during this madness, Jody, who really hadn't gotten better, she just stabilized, she actually was moved out of the emergency room and over to the ICU, pretty much just to create one more space for new patients. And so in the ICU, Jody's fiance sat next to her, gripping her hand, listening to the sound of the monitors beeping steadily all around her. Outside the room, he could see doctors and nurses and medical staff sprinting up and down the hallways, looking frantic and worried. He had no idea what was happening here. He just hoped Jody would be okay. But it would turn out there actually was someone who knew exactly what was going on. A university researcher named Philip Taylor had actually predicted this the day before. Professor Taylor was an expert in atmospheric allergens, a field so niche that barely anybody outside of his small research circle had even heard of it. And so on the afternoon of November 20th, the day before, Taylor had been at home in his office analyzing data when he noticed something very alarming. All of the ingredients for a catastrophic event were aligning in the forecast, and the patterns were so precise that it stopped him cold. Taylor was stunned. He'd spent years studying the effects of weather on public health, but he'd never seen anything like this before. And at the same time, Taylor also realized that as alarming as this was, very few other people, if anybody, would see this as a problem. He was like the one person in the world that had the expertise to see how catastrophic this might actually be. And so desperate to warn others, he wound up posting a very urgent announcement on this weather website that he managed. But unfortunately, it just wasn't seen by enough people in time. And so now, as hospitals all across Melbourne overflowed with people gasping for air, Taylor sat in his backyard watching the storm unfold. The sky was pitch black, rain and hail was coming down, the wind was whipping, and off in the distance, all he could hear was thunder and sirens. And he knew, unfortunately, his prediction had been right. Just like Professor Taylor's weather models had predicted, on November 21st, 2016, Melbourne, Australia was hit by an extremely rare event known as thunderstorm asthma. This deadly phenomenon can only occur when three very specific weather conditions align. 1, high heat during the day. 2, a very powerful thunderstorm, and 3, extremely high pollen levels. Melbourne's heat that day had caused unusually high concentrations of ryegrass pollen to hang in the air. And then when that huge thunderstorm rolled in, the intense humidity, the wind, and the rain shattered the pollen grains into microscopic fragments. And then these tiny particles, which were way smaller than regular pollen, were carried by this storm deep into people's homes and into their lungs. Unlike normal pollen, these microscopic fragments bypassed the body's typical defenses and embedded themselves deep into people's lungs, causing severe and sudden asthma attacks. Now, for people who already had asthma, this was catastrophic. But even perfectly healthy people found themselves gasping for air, overwhelmed by the sheer density of this microscopic pollen. The storm had essentially made the air everybody in Melbourne was breathing deadly. As for Jody Santoro, she would spend days in the ICU, hooked up to monitors, with machines pumping oxygen into her lungs while her body fought to heal. But she was lucky. She would eventually recover. And in the days that followed, she would learn the full scale of what actually happened in Melbourne. Nearly 10,000 people had flooded the hospitals across Australia, complaining of the same symptoms that Jody did. And unfortunately, of those 10,000, 10 people actually lost their lives. And many of them were totally healthy and had never had an asthma attack in their lives before. For Jody, despite surviving this ordeal, the awful memory of what happened on that night will forever be on her mind. She is now all too aware of how fragile life can be and how quickly things can change.